When I was 12, the house felt smaller than it had any right to be. Not physically, though the peeling wallpaper and bowed door frames certainly didn't help, but emotionally, like the air itself had been compressed. Voices carried through walls whether they meant to or not. Anger had a way of finding its way into everything. The clink of dishes, the thud of footsteps, the silence that followed slammed doors. My parents were fighting constantly, about money mostly, but also about things that felt older than me, heavier than anything I could understand. I learned early that arguments were rarely about what they claimed to be about. We were poor in the way that doesn't feel temporary. The kind of poor that settles into your bones and teaches you to notice everything that costs money. The sound the fridge makes when it's nearly empty, the look adults exchange when bills come in the mail, the particular shame of school forms that require fees your parents have to pretend not to see. Poverty wasn't dramatic. It was relentless. It was deciding not to ask for things because you already knew the answer. It was learning how to become small. There were other issues too, things I didn't have language for yet. The quiet awareness that I was different, that something about me existed at a slight angle to the rest of the world. I didn't know the word homosexual then, not really, only that the feelings I had didn't align with the expectations laid out so casually by adults and television shows and classmates. It felt like another secret I had to keep, another room in the house I wasn't allowed to enter. I didn't have many friends. I wasn't bullied exactly. That would have required someone to notice me. Mostly, I existed in the background. Teachers saw me as capable but unremarkable. Other kids saw me as quiet. I learned early how to disappear without actually leaving. The bike was my escape. It wasn't anything special. Rusted chain, chipped paint, a faint squeal when I braked, but it worked. Every afternoon, when the tension inside the house reached a certain pitch, I would wheel it out to the road and start riding up and down the same stretch of pavement. Back and forth, an hour sometimes, more if I could get away with it. As I rode, I whispered. Not loudly. Not enough for anyone to hear clearly. Just under my breath, words tumbling out in fragments. Complaints. Questions. Rehearsed arguments I would never have the courage to voice inside the house. I told myself what I wished I could tell them. I told myself things I didn't want to admit I knew. I vented in a way that felt half confession, half exorcism. The road became a loop, and within that loop I could say anything. I knew, abstractly, that people might see me and think something was wrong with me. A kid riding back and forth, muttering to himself like a character out of a cautionary tale. But I also knew that nobody was really watching. That was the strange comfort of being invisible. You could do almost anything and still be ignored. The upside was that I was in excellent shape. My legs grew strong without me noticing. The movement helped. The rhythm helped. The whispering helped most of all. It gave my thoughts somewhere to land instead of ricocheting endlessly inside my head. That was the ritual. The road, the bike, the whispering. It became so routine that I barely thought about it anymore. Until the afternoon I saw him. It was late summer, the air thick and unmoving, the sky washed out blue. I was halfway through my usual circuit when I noticed an old man standing by a mailbox on the opposite side of the road. He was thin, dressed plainly, wearing clothes that seemed out of step with the time. Neither outdated nor modern, just neutral. He stood very still, one hand resting lightly on the top of the mailbox as if it were an anchor. He was whispering to himself. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of people talk to themselves, especially old people. But then I noticed the way he was doing it. He wasn't turned inward, wasn't lost in his own head. He was angled toward the road. Toward me. As I rode past, he made deliberate eye contact. Held it just long enough to register. And his whispering, whatever it was, grew slightly more pronounced, as if he wanted to be sure it was noticed. Something about it felt staged. On my next pass, he did it again. Same posture. Same whispering. Same careful, measured eye contact. Not aggressive, not mocking exactly, but intentional. As though he were mirroring me. A hot, familiar flush of embarrassment crept up my neck. My first instinct was that he was making fun of me. That somehow, despite years of anonymity, I had finally been seen, and not kindly. I stopped my bike. The decision surprised even me. I wasn't confrontational by nature, but something about the way he watched me, the way he seemed to be performing, ignited a small, stubborn spark of anger. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of being overlooked. Maybe it was just a bad day. Either way, I turned the bike around and rode directly toward him. Up close, he looked older than I'd thought. Not frail, but worn, like something that had been handled carefully for a very long time. His eyes were sharp, alert, far more present than his posture suggested. He stopped whispering as I approached. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. He smiled, not broadly, not patronizingly, just enough to soften his face. "I was hoping you'd stop," he said. That threw me off immediately. Adults usually wanted me to go away. This one seemed pleased. "I thought you were making fun of me," I said, because honesty felt easier than whatever game this was. "Not at all," he replied. I was recognizing something familiar. I didn't know what to do with that. He gestured to the bike, then to the road. "You do this every day?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "Most days." "And the talking?" I felt my ears burn. "Yeah, that too." "Why?" The question was simple, almost gentle, but it landed heavily. I didn't have a polished answer ready. I had never been asked. "Trouble at home," I said finally, vague enough to be safe. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. We talked for a while after that. Or rather, he asked questions, and I answered them. Mundane questions, like he was filling out a form only he could see. "Where would you like to move when you're older? Do you have any siblings? What do you like doing when you're alone? Do you feel older or younger than the other kids at school?" Each question seemed harmless on its own, but taken together, they formed a shape. I felt seen in a way that made me slightly uneasy. He listened too closely, noticed pauses, inflections, the things I didn't say as much as the things I did. At some point, he said, very casually, "You know, you don't feel the way they expect you to." My stomach dropped. "I don't know what you mean," I said. He didn't push, just smiled again, that same quiet, knowing smile. "That's all right," he said. "You will." There was no accusation in his voice. No judgment. Just certainty. By the end of the conversation, he had somehow mapped me. My loneliness. My anger. My queerness. Unnamed but unmistakable. My habit of turning inward because there was nowhere else to go. It felt like being gently disassembled. Before I left, he gave me advice. "Find a way to make something out of all that noise," he said. "Something that stays." I asked him what he meant. "Draw. Write. Build. Doesn't matter what. Just don't let it rot inside you." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. Then I rode home. I never saw him again. Not the next day. Not the day after that. Not ever. Eventually, curiosity overcame discomfort, and I asked the people who lived in the house by the mailbox if they knew him. Described him as best I could. They didn't. No one had ever seen him. No relative, no neighbor, no friend who matched the description. For years, I wondered if I'd imagined him. If stress and isolation had finally crossed some invisible threshold. But the advice stayed with me. The feeling of being understood stayed with me. I did find a creative outlet. Several, over the years. Art became the place where I put everything I couldn't say out loud. I'm an artist to this day. Sometimes, when I'm working, I catch myself whispering. Not out of frustration anymore, but out of habit. Out of memory. And sometimes, I wonder who he was. Or if he was ever really there at all. I learned German at the Defense Language Institute, which is a sentence that sounds far less threatening than it deserves. On paper, it was a 9-month course. In reality, it was a controlled academic demolition. The military doesn't advertise it this way, but DLI isn't just a school, it's a filter. Languages are the medium, pressure is the point. We started with 15 people. By the time we graduated, there were 6 of us left. The attrition wasn't dramatic in a cinematic way. Nobody screamed or flipped desks. People just disappeared. One week they were in your study group. The next week their chair was empty and no one talked about it. Some failed academically, some mentally, some physically. A few realized early on that the cost wasn't worth the career path and quietly bowed out. The rest of us kept going because inertia is powerful and pride even more so. German was considered one of the easier languages at DLI, which says more about DLI than it does about German. It was still collegiate-level immersion, compressed into 9 months, with the expectation that you would be able to read, write, speak, and understand at operational speed by the end. There was no easing into it. Day 1, the instructors spoke German. Day 2, they spoke German faster. By week 3, English felt like a crutch you were ashamed to reach for. We had about 6 hours of class a day and another 4 hours of homework every night. That was the baseline. If you were struggling, and most of us were, you added more. Flashcards at meals. Grammar drills during breaks. Listening exercises while brushing your teeth. You learned to think in terms of efficiency because there simply wasn't time for anything else. I barely made it through. That's not self-deprecation. That's a statement of fact. I passed by inches, by stubbornness, by grinding effort. There were weeks where my brain felt physically sore, like a muscle that had been overworked and then asked to perform again anyway. I would lie in bed replaying sentence structures, verb placements, separable prefixes, my mind refusing to shut off. There were days I thought seriously about failing out, about whether it would be easier to let go than to keep pushing. And then there was him. He looked like every other Midwestern kid the military produces in bulk. White, average height, average build, no particular affectation. If you had lined us all up and been asked to pick out the prodigy, no one would have chosen him. He didn't brag. He didn't posture. He didn't dominate conversations. He wasn't socially awkward or overly intense. He was just normal. Except he was effortlessly, terrifyingly brilliant. He was the top student in our class from the very beginning. Not in the way that made instructors suspicious, but in the way that made them quietly recalibrate expectations. He absorbed German like it was remembering something rather than learning it. Vocabulary stuck instantly. Grammar didn't seem to bother him. Pronunciation wasn't something he practiced. It was something he noticed. We found out early on that he already knew Spanish and Portuguese. Not took a couple years in high school knew. Fluent knew. Native sounding knew. Dialect switching knew. He could speak Spanish like he was from Spain or the Dominican Republic without thinking about it. Could slide between Brazilian and European Portuguese as if it were a matter of mood. That alone would have been impressive enough. But the way he told the story made it stranger. Before joining the military, he'd worked construction after high school. He said he'd picked up some Spanish on job sites. That was how he framed it. Some Spanish. No mention of aptitude, no talk of talent. Just exposure and curiosity. When he got to DLI and tested high in Spanish, they put him in Portuguese. He tested out of that too. The schools at DLI are scheduled for fixed lengths of time, and students arrive with report dates already assigned. His report date was far enough out that the system didn't quite know what to do with him, so they kept assigning him languages. At first, he didn't realize what was happening. He thought this was just how it worked. But eventually, he figured it out. As long as he kept finishing early, they'd keep feeding him another language. So he slowed down. Not in a lazy way. In a deliberate way. He stayed in German with us for the full 9 months. He showed up, did the work, helped classmates when asked. He never flaunted what he could do. But about halfway through the course, he did something that finally broke everyone's sense of proportion. He turned in a science fiction novel. Written entirely in German. Not a short story. Not an exercise. A book. Original plot, original characters, competent prose. Not flawless, no second language ever is, but good enough that our instructors stared at it longer than they were supposed to. Good enough that it clearly wasn't an academic stunt. It was something he had written because he wanted to. That was when the rumors really started. Up until then, People had chalked him up as that smart language guy. After that, he became something else. A statistical anomaly. A walking violation of the curve. You could feel the morale dip slightly when people talked about it. Not out of resentment, exactly, but out of existential fatigue. It's hard enough to struggle honestly without being reminded that someone else is playing an entirely different game. When German ended, he didn't go to his unit. They put him in Arabic. Arabic, which is a 1.5-year-long program by itself. A language with a different alphabet, radically different structure, multiple registers, and dialects that barely resemble one another. When he finished that, they put him in Farsi. By the time I was celebrating the fact that I could finally read a German newspaper article without wanting to cry, he had cycled through Spanish, Portuguese, German, Arabic, and Farsi. Dialects included. Accents included. Writing included. He had written multiple books along the way. And yet, this is the part that still sticks with me, he never seemed overwhelmed. We were friends. Not inseparable, but close enough to talk honestly. He studied like everyone else. He complained about homework. He laughed at dumb jokes. He didn't isolate himself or act superior. If you didn't know his academic output, you would never guess it. That was almost the strangest part. One night, late, after another long day, I finally asked him how he did it. Not accusingly. Not challengingly. Just genuinely. I needed to know if there was a trick I was missing, or if the answer was simply that some people are built differently. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said his favorite way to learn a new language was through music. Specifically, he would take songs he already knew in English, songs where the rhythm, emotion, and intent were already ingrained, and translate them into the new language. But not word for word. Never word for word. That doesn't work, he said, like it was obvious. Instead, he would learn about the people who spoke the language. Their humor. Their cultural shortcuts. The things they implied instead of stated outright. And then he would rewrite the lyrics the way they would say it. Same feeling. Same intent. Different bones. He didn't describe it as talent. He described it as listening. As empathy, almost. As stepping sideways into another mental framework and letting the language shape itself naturally inside it. How he figured that out, I still don't know. I graduated. He moved on to another language. Life continued. We lost touch the way people often do when shared suffering is the primary bond. But I still think about him sometimes, not with jealousy, not really, but with a kind of quiet recalibration. Meeting someone like that forces you to confront the fact that human potential is wildly uneven, and not always in visible ways. That intelligence doesn't always announce itself. That genius can look like a guy doing homework next to you at midnight, complaining about verb conjugations like everyone else. I learned German. He learned the world. I only worked with him briefly, which in retrospect feels appropriate. People like that never seem to pass through your life for long. Long enough to leave an impression, not long enough for it to become ordinary. He came to our team as a temporary placement. Frontline experience, they said. A box to tick before promotion. On paper, he was just another officer rotating through. In practice, he was someone who had already spent years in the kind of units people don't talk about openly. The sort of investigations that don't end in dramatic arrests but in quiet files, sealed statements, and long chains of inference. The secretive stuff. High-end work. I'll call him Dave. Dave didn't look like anything special. That was a recurring theme with him. Middle-aged, unassuming, calm to the point of blandness. He spoke politely, listened more than he talked, and treated everyone, colleagues and members of the public alike, with the same steady courtesy. If you'd met him socially, you'd have clocked him as competent, maybe thoughtful, but not remarkable. On the job, though, you could feel there was something else going on behind his eyes. This was during a period when we were dealing with serious gang-on-gang violence. The kind that spikes suddenly and poisons an entire area. Tensions high, weapons circulating, retaliation expected. A young man had been murdered not far from where we were working, and in response a Section 60 had been authorized, Stop and search without the usual requirement of reasonable suspicion. It's an ugly but sometimes necessary tool, and when it's in force, the atmosphere on the streets changes immediately. Everyone feels it. We were working one of the affected areas. Concrete, corner shops, narrow streets where people watch from windows but pretend not to. You develop a sense for who belongs to the chaos and who's just passing through it. And these two men we stopped were very obviously in the second category. Early 30s, both of them. No edge. No tension. No attempt to posture or provoke. They complied immediately, answered questions calmly, chatted with us like people who knew this was an inconvenience rather than an accusation. Within seconds, I'd mentally written them off as unrelated to anything we were actually looking for. We finished the stop. Nothing found. All routine. That should have been the end of it. Then Dave, in that same polite, friendly tone he used for everything, said to one of them, "I think I know you." The man laughed lightly, shook his head. "Nah. Must be someone else." "I don't think so," Dave said. "No challenge in it. No pressure. Just certainty." The man looked genuinely confused. "I've never been in trouble. Never been arrested. Never had dealings with the police at all." I believed him. Everything about his manner said he was telling the truth. And standing there, I started to feel uncomfortable, not because of the man, but because of the social awkwardness of the moment. This was edging into that territory where a stop becomes something else, and I was already mentally preparing to smooth it over. Dave smiled gently. "I believe you haven't," he said. Then, after a beat, "Your dad did though." That stopped everyone cold. The man's expression shifted, not alarmed, not angry, just startled. "My dad?" Dave nodded, still calm. "Let me have a look at you." The man, to his credit, remained good-natured. A little baffled, but not defensive. I, on the other hand, felt intensely awkward. This felt invasive in a way stops usually aren't, and I had no idea where Dave was going with it. The man repeated, almost reflexively, "I've never been in any trouble." "I know," Dave said. Then he did something I still think about. He said the man's full name. Then his date of birth. Then his old address, from when he was a child. Then his mother's name and her date of birth. Then his father's name. Then, finally, he explained. 22 years earlier, Dave had attended a domestic incident at that address. The man in front of us had been a preteen at the time. His parents were arguing. His father was drunk. Nothing dramatic. Nothing violent. A minor breach of the peace. The sort of thing officers deal with dozens of times a year. The father had been arrested to sleep it off. No criminal career. No pattern. Just a bad night, decades ago. And Dave had remembered it. Not just the incident. The people. The child's face. Enough to age him forward more than 2 decades and recognize him on a street during a weapons stop, under entirely different circumstances, in a different phase of both their lives. The man stared at him, stunned. Then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "That's mad," he said. "I don't even remember that." "I wouldn't expect you to," Dave replied. There was no accusation. No implication. No leverage. Just recognition. We wrapped it up after that. Exchanged a few polite words. Let them go on their way. They walked off shaking their heads, probably to tell the story later as something bizarre that happened to them once. I stood there for a second longer than usual, trying to recalibrate my understanding of the man I was standing next to. That wasn't luck. That wasn't database recall or a clever trick. That was a mind that catalogued human detail at a level most people simply don't. Faces, contexts, names, timelines, stored, indexed, retrievable decades later without effort. Suddenly his career made sense. The units he'd worked in. The quiet reputation. The way he observed more than he spoke. No wonder he was in the high-end investigation teams. I'd worked with plenty of intelligent officers. Plenty of diligent ones. Plenty who were sharp under pressure. But that was something else entirely. Not showy. Not performative. Just a frighteningly precise memory paired with calm empathy. We finished the shift. Life went on. Dave moved on to whatever came next for him. But every so often, when people talk about genius as if it's always loud or obvious, I think about that moment on the street. About a man who recognized a stranger not as a suspect, not as a statistic, but as a child he'd met once, 22 years earlier, and remembered every detail that mattered. If you enjoyed these stories, consider liking the video and subscribing. I'm always interested in moments where intelligence crosses from impressive into unsettling. The kind that sticks with you long after it's over. If you've ever witnessed something similar, feel free to share it in the comments. I read them all. Thanks for watching.